Welcome to Troublemakers, Patience Nitumwesiga.
Thank you.
It's great to have you.
It's good to be here.
Back in 2017, we met at a workshop over the weekend, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And there was like a prompt the facilitator gave us to get to know other people in the room. And you and I sat opposite from each other. And the question they gave us was, what makes good development?
Mm-hmm.
And I remember we both kind of looked at each other. We never had a conversation before, and we kind of we could see that in one another we were scoffing at the question. Like, why should we presume development is good? And I think as we talked a little bit more, we soon found out that both of us had not only read Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, the famous Brazilian pedagogue, but that we had applied that theory and affiliated methodologies to our lives. And I want to take us back to this conversation. So, Nitumwesiga, maybe you can tell us what Paulo Freire has meant to you.
So, I was introduced to Paulo Freire at the same time as Augusto Boal. I think in my second year at university, we had this course called Applied Theater. It was taught by one of my favorite professors called Dr. Mangeni. And part of for me, the reason that I've hated development for a long time, I think at that time I felt validated by the stuff that we were introduced to, and the beauty of being, introduced to Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Theater of the Oppressed, and then Rainbow of Desire, which was also a book that Augusto Boal wrote, was that being a student that's in drama school, you're always thinking about entertainment and the mainstream performance, but you don't think about what performance means to humans and why we have so much performance since a long time ago, since the Greeks, and their amphitheaters, and since the days people used to throw food at the stage at actors. There's always been something that we're looking for in that performance, and there's been aristocrats that have theorized about it, and art being a mirror of society and all those things. But I think what really concretized for me being introduced to Boal and Freire at the same time was the idea that everything, the content comes from the people, and it's bottom up. Because I think we were raised in a colonial education where the teacher knew everything and we didn't know anything. And that's sort of how colonization worked. It was that our colonizers knew everything civilization-wise, and we were barbaric. We didn't know anything. But then you meet these people who are actually, even education, something as fundamental as education, shouldn't be bottom down. You're a teacher, you went to school, but you should never assume that your students know nothing, or that the community that you're teaching something, and that's, where we come to development, that you are bringing them development, and these ideas that they don't. It was nice to really crush that concept and reconstruct it and be it's shared knowledge. You share knowledge, something, but there's a lot that you don't know, and that your audience, your students, your constituency, they always have ideas. And so you just have to create a platform where you can share.
So in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire talks about what you're describing as the banking system, that colonial idea of I have the knowledge, I'm going to deposit into the empty accounts of these pupils' heads. Their brains are unoccupied by anything. Finally, in a paternalistic way, I give them this patronizing knowledge, and thanks to me, they now have it. And he proposes this idea of problem-posing education, that we all have knowledge and we can discover it. And the educator is kind of like this facilitator of self-discovery.
Yes.
And uh, with that problem posing education, there's a key component of dialogue. And I think this is one of the things I would like to discuss with you, because um, your work as a filmmaker, as a theater maker, as a writer, we might be tempted to think that the creative, the visionary, the prophet, the writer kind of like sits on their own in this world that's separate from everything else, and they have this idea that lives in their head, and then they put it on the paper and give it to us. That would be the banking model of doing your kind of work. But I've been to enough film festivals and screenings of your films, and shows that exhibit your art, etc., that I've been able to see that for you, things really come alive when people interact with it. When people share from their own experience or from their own heart what they thought about or what they felt when they were interacting with your art and the stories that you tell. Can you talk about this dialogical component, if we're to call it that, of your work as a writer, a storyteller?
Yeah, maybe before we get to dialogue, for me, I look at it as something that happens in steps. And one of the lessons that stands out for me from that applied theater class is the idea of conscientization. Because I think we mistake that as something else usually. And sometimes usually what the masses need is conscientization, is to realize that there is a problem. And sometimes they're not able to realize that by themselves because they've been, living under propaganda and like all these things that our capitalist states do and fascist states, they keep people in a cycle where information is sort of hidden from them by a veil. And so sometimes all you need to do is help them realize there's a veil. And then they have to take the veil off themselves, and then it goes to ownership, and the things that follow. And I don't want to get into the scientific, discussion of that. But, coming back to this dialogue that happens, it's a sharing as well. It's not a very one-sided dialogue. And there is such a thing because I think there's a lot of people who want to talk, but they don't want to listen. But when you come to that sharing table or circle, I think for me as a creator, as a storyteller, I always find that I have some information that I know about. I've packaged it for you, but people receive it differently also. And they have a right to. And the thing I like about films, for instance, is that once you've made it, it's not yours anymore. It's out there and it has its own life with how people relate with it and how they respond to it. And for me, like, it's always so interesting to just like listen to people talk and discover things you didn't even know that you were talking about. But because they have more knowledge than you, so they build onto the knowledge that you're presenting them and they're able to grow it into something bigger. Yeah.
And also, before you even write the story down or even consciously start the brainstorming process of a story, is there not like a dialogue that has often taken place? Like maybe you've talked with people, or maybe you've like witnessed how people behave in a marketplace or something, and these things feed into the characters and worlds that you create.
Yeah.
So they don't come out of your own
No, absolutely. And I think it's one of those things that people think you're crazy as a storyteller, but you never feel like the stories are coming from you. It's like they're coming from your society. And some of these are things you've observed for such a long time, and you've been observing something and you didn't realize that it was there, sitting there in your subconscious, and then it just comes out and you realize, like, okay, like some people ask me, for instance, why I like feminist work and why I'm such a radical feminist. I never thought I was a radical feminist. So when I meet people like that, I'm like, what do you mean? I've just been like meeting people. I've grown up in this place where women are being told ABC, and it's just driven me crazy for the longest time since I was a teenager. So now it's coming out, and you're like, you're a radical feminist. And for me, it's never about titles and labels. It's just about the experience that I have with this world. I'm also in dialogue with the society. I'm in dialogue with the world. And so I receive information from this society that has raised me. And as an African who's always code switching, because every African is bilingual, and always code switches. You have the language of your parents and sometimes different parents. You have the language of your village. You have the language of your city. You have the language of your school and then your work. It's always, morphing. And I think as humans, we're also always constantly in dialogue with all those different parts of who we are. And it's
like an inner dialogue with ourselves.
Yes, absolutely.
Different versions of ourselves.
Yeah, but also like as we interact with the world, like sometimes I think you notice something is coming out and you're like, where did this come from? But it's part of like, this is the world that made you or raised you, and you're also trying to become your own person and to have your own reflections on that world. But we're also constantly putting those reflections forward so that other people can reflect on those reflections.
I remember when I first gave Pedagogy of the Oppressed a thorough read, because it's a short book, but it's like savory. You can't like rush through it or skim through it. You have to like, it's dense, and full of kind of primary source wisdom. It feels that way to me. I remember as I was reading it, it was helping me frame my reality in such a way that like resonated with me. I felt like I had this analysis living in me, but I just needed kind of like a language for it. And I think it was like a gift from Paulo Freire in that way. And much as it was a gift, it also felt like a burden. Like now I would have to like apply this because I can't read this and not.
Yes.
If it resonated with me like that, it would have to change my life in some way, And well, for me, I think part of that became like the burden of building like a more conscious world means that we must resist the bad things, the oppression in it, the systematic oppression within it. And I think that takes us back to our question about development, because I think before that, I sort of thought I thought of community work as sometimes there's resistance, but mostly we're just trying to help each other get by, and we want people to be more educated. We want people to succeed in their having like a basic living for their families, and like I would still see like the semi-capitalist kind of nonprofit work as sort of having equal legitimacy with like the resistance and social change work. And after reading that, I was like, no, like the structure of power in the world is the thing that we actually need to look at here. And if we're engaged in some kind of self-deception that we can do good work that doesn't address that, like it created this like real burden for me. Like now everything that I committed myself to would have to deal with critical theory. It would have to deal with power. And I wonder if you felt that burden before we met in 2017, perhaps because you did a lot of like community theater work throughout mostly East Africa, I guess. Was there some kind of point where you felt like, okay, this community development thing, all right, but it's really not for me because it doesn't really kind of like fit into this pedagogy of the oppressed that I've been exposed to?
I think over time there's been a lot of frustrations for me when it relates to power and hidden power, especially that people don't want to talk about, especially in the civil society plus or slash community development work. And for me, I think I always wanted to exercise that kind of like awareness that, that I I don't want to say achieved, but that I attained after, going through some of that work. And I think going to theater school, to drama school also radicalized me more because we were engaging with lots of work. It wasn't just, those guys. We were reading a lot of plays that were discussing those issues. And so I was becoming more of like a fuller person that was realizing like, oh, I've always felt these things. And now school is making them more interesting because I can theorize about them. I can concretely have discussions that are informed by people who have written about this stuff. But then you get out there into the field and you realize like, no matter how much you want to do, sometimes even where the funding is coming from and the people that are with the grants, they still want to inform and deposit their knowledges, to these people. And it doesn't matter that, this is what the people in the community. I've had, so many like fights with, I used to do a lot of consultancies with organizations that are trying to work in communities. And you're like, this is what I believe. And you're so passionate because we were young. I hadn't even graduated when I started doing that kind of work. But over time, even after I finished school, I was just like, it's this very, how do you call it? Very depowering. What is there a word like that?
Disempowering?
Yeah, disempowering, but also like you feel so helpless being in this cycle where you believe that you're there to do conscientization with the public, but you then realize too late there's an agenda with the person that's like sending you. And they want those people to believe.
What would be like an example of that agenda?
So for instance, you are going to a community and telling them about gender and violence issues. And you've got this grant and you're going out there, you're creating maybe some plays, and creating dialogue with the community or, making a few short films and screening them and having discussions. And the people are giving you ideas that are completely outside of what this donor organization maybe understands. And they're just like, they have their own way of life. And it doesn't fit within the narrative that this funder has. It's just like violence is bad and men and women should do equal stuff, And it's just like, what does that even mean? For a lot of villages that I visited, there's a lot of women that had different kinds of power. They didn't want to be, seen differently. They didn't want to take what they thought was the job of their husbands because it works like that in their village. And maybe some of it, ends up being abusive, but they have their own power structures. And so you come in and you're trying to get them to talk, and they're talking, but then you have to keep saying, but do you know that, according
You're supposed to change in this way.
Yes, you're supposed to
be a little bit more like me.
Yes, to believe this thing. It's very challenging. And as a person who's just like gone through a lot of transformation, you want to give them the grace to, go through that. But I feel like the way donor projects work, there's never enough time for you to give people enough, time to transform on their own. So you want to put things down their throat. And now that I'm making documentaries also, I'm realizing like we see a lot of documentaries that do that. They want to, push information down your throat, as opposed to taking time with your characters and figuring out how different they are. And the reason we hate, and it takes us back to what we were saying about development, we don't see difference as a part of the world that we live in. We see it as developed and underdeveloped, It's the same way that,
Good and bad.
Yeah, good and bad, developed and not developed. I saw a clip recently of somebody saying how Zanzibar is so different. Why do people hype it up so much? It's different. And I'm like, what do you expect Zanzibar to be? You want it to be, I don't know, Dubai? You want it to be Paris, So there's that.
They were using the word different.
Yeah,
like
and in a bad way.
yeah.
Like, and they took pictures of like, I don't know, kids on the beach playing, and it's like, no, they don't want that to be there. They want like, you know, Bali, whatever. And I'm like, this is not Bali, this is Zanzibar. Like, you have to expect a place to be different. And I think the reason I have a very huge problem with development is it expects every place to be the same. And as Africans, I think for a long time we've been on the receiving end of that kind of negative energy of saying you must have big houses and big mansions and big cities. And it's like, but that's not our style. We don't even like being indoors. We like hanging out under the tree. And that's poverty to a lot of people. So I think for me, it helped me receive and also interact with people differently, because I'm at a different point as like the person who's coming with a grant from some, Western, global North ideology that doesn't fully understand what it means when Africans eat their food and don't need money. It's like, oh, you live below the poverty line because you live under you live under $1. It's like, most village people here don't need money. So what do you mean? But you can't quantify, their organic food that they have from their gardens. So all of that, I think, for me, came together in a very interesting way.
Yeah, and it's also not a 1-for-1, like $1 equals X number of tomatoes or bananas.
Yeah.
Like those forms of like capitalist analysis of people's situations around the world really break down at some level. So there's this word that you brought up, conscientization, which is a dense word. And Paulo Freire kind of relates it to this concept of becoming more fully human. So to be conscientized, is to discover and actualize your own humanity more deeply. And in your storytelling, this is something that I think really comes up. You want your characters to have layers and complexity that honor their humanity, and make them more compelling characters. Can you talk about some of your favorite characters in both your nonfiction and fiction work, and whether this concept of depth of humanity comes up for you?
That's a hard one. But I think some of my characters are always on that journey of conscientization. And the quickest one I can think of is Nitera from How to Forget Your Name, because she's this person who's thinking in this individualist, one goal, one person way that we've been taught by the global North. And then, as time goes on, as she gets all these challenges, she gets to realize a little bit too late that her power had always been with the bigger extended family and the bigger community, and nobody can tell you that. That's the thing. You have to learn it by yourself. It's also the sad part about life. It's like nobody's waiting with a handbook and saying, at this point in your life, you have to. So I like to have characters like that. There's also characters that I have in my films that I think are more conscientized than others, that have attained some level of conscientization that they're proud of. Like Stella Nyanzi, which is like, luckily not a fiction project, but a documentary project. And because this is a living person that has decided, this is who I am. I remember, thinking like, this person represents so many things about self-actualization that the stigma that has come with modern, ideals, especially for women in this region, like marriage. You have to be married. She has a failed marriage. She's not seen her husband. She hadn't seen her husband in like 15 years at the time. And she was a full woman. She had kids. She raised her kids by herself with her family, the stronger family, the bigger extended family. Her mother, her dad, her sisters, those are the people that helped her raise her kids. And I think those African values have been disappearing because we're trying to attain this very Western nuclear family thing. So for me, having a person like that, that's like, I didn't have a husband, so I had to raise my kids by myself. Like for me, that's already a level of trying not to care a lot about what the expectations are in the modern world, in the colonized world as well. And also things like being able to talk about the different things that she values, having a boyfriend, or like there's so many limitations for women in the modern world. And people make it seem like, oh, it's for African women. The standards are for African women. And African women before, I know for a fact, before colonization had way more power. And so it's good to see people that are taking back some of that power. And so it's like an honor to document people like that. But even if you think about like Heaven Sounds Boring.
Before you hold that Heaven Sounds Boring thought, Stella Nyanzi, aka The Woman Who Poked the Leopard, which is also the title of your feature documentary that's coming out this year.
Mm-hmm.
You do show her as a very conscious person in conscious pursuit of her fullest humanity.
Mm-hmm.
But part of your portrayal of her is also her challenges, her a side of her which is weak at times.
Mm-hmm.
And why do you do this? Does this actually humanize her more if you're able to show that side of her as well, not just the public figure that is a loud, disruptive activist that gets a lot of things done in the public space?
Yeah, I mean, there's the humanizing part, but there's also the reality of us always constantly being in dialogue with the world and with ourselves and with our family. So, some of the challenges she has is she's working toward, and the kids need her. The kids confront her and they're like, you're never here. You're always out there doing your work. And the truth is, which human is capable of being a full-time mom and a full-time worker? Nobody, So this is why, for the kids, at some point, I think it's like, you're providing for us, but you're not being there. And for Stella, it's like, but I'm providing and I'm finding ways to be there. So it's not also a matter of like flows or whatever. It's more like the humanity and the things we go through every day. I go through the same, I want to be there for my kids. I want to be present, but sometimes I have to work. And sometimes you watch your kid cry and say, I want to spend time with you, and you're not able to do that. And what does that do to you as a person and how you choose to live through life? So it's also not an either or. I think it's more like, how do you figure out when to focus on what? Yeah.
There's a point in the film. I'm not gonna do spoilers, but there's a point in the film where Stella's daughter asks you, who's behind the camera for the whole film, to show up for a tough conversation that she wants to have with her mom.
Yeah.
And there are plenty of styles of filmmaking where the filmmaker disappears, or you just never see them in the first place. You kind of feel like the filmmaker is not there. But in this scene, she's kind of looking straight at you. You're behind the camera. She's looking straight at you. She's asking you. She's inviting you in to do something. To me, this was an interesting thing because I think in documentary film, as the audience, you sort of feel like you're in the filmmaker's shoes, like you're there documenting the story with them. And that's like the unique aspect of being an audience for a documentary instead of fiction. And I felt like when her daughter was asking you to come and bring your cameras to a conversation that she wanted to have with her mom, I felt like I was also being brought into the conversation. This was a tough film. I mean, you were up against repressive conditions to film it. You were pregnant during a lot of the production, or breastfeeding thereafter. You had fellow workers to take care of as a director. So you're constantly, you have also the personal relationships with the people who are like the subjects of the film, for lack of a
Mm-hmm.
better word. So you're wearing all these different hats, and I wonder if um, during all of this, like, you experienced that kind of conscientization or change in yourself as a result of doing something that was so dialogical in form.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, when I started out making that film, I thought it was going to be a verite film, which means you don't interact, don't, show up. You are a fly on the wall. You're just observing. But I mean, Stella and her kids wouldn't let us do that. And I've listened to a lot of conversation about documentaries and ethically what you're allowed to do and intervene or not intervene. And
They're like hard rules.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I think the conversation is always changing. But I think for me, I had to do something that I felt was like ethically okay with me and that I would live with. And for a long time, we had been in that house working with those kids. I was asking for their permission all the time. And sometimes they would say yes, sometimes they would say no. And we were getting very close. So when, Baraka asked me to come and like do this, interview with their mom, not interview, but conversation, it felt like it wasn't about the camera, it was about the family. They had a conversation they needed, and the camera was going to act like a backing of sorts. And I was proud. It's one of my proudest moments in the making of that film because I knew Stella. I didn't know the kids when we started the film. And the kids slowly became, my friends. But for me being asked that, it was like intervene right in the process. It wasn't like, oh, after the film was made, then we were able to have conversations. It's like, no, while the film was being made, we realized we could have some conversations that were hard to have with mom without the camera. So I think it's like every documentary filmmaker's dream that you get that close with your participants. So I find that moment very, very special for me. And it was also a chance for me to prove like I'm not just here like extracting your story. I'm part of this process. You're part of this family for a long time. And I think it's also like an African value that, when you're in a space, you're not just like in a role, you're also like a part of that space, being in conversation with it, dialoguing with it. So our process as well was like affecting us both behind the camera and in front of the camera, and we were being challenged by the making of the film to talk about things that were hard. And I've been asked, like some industry professionals have looked at the cut, like, are you sure this is comfortable? And from the beginning, Stella gave me like absolute creative control. She was like, I'm not gonna get involved. And some of those parts, like when people would ask me, like, do you think she'll be okay with this? I would be like, I know in my heart she will be, because she's someone who's constantly in dialogue with herself and
Yeah.
with the world.
And she's self-critical.
Yes,
Part of her
critiquing herself.
self-actualization is that she's so harsh on herself in a way about certain things, so honest with herself that I'm not doing this for the movement, I'm doing it for me and for my family's situation.
And actually, that scene, before when I was writing down what we're going to include, I thought we wouldn't include that scene in the car. We were going to include the dialogue, the discussion that Stella had with her kids. And my editor, this is credit to my editor, came to me and said, this conversation will mean so much more if you actually have the scene in the car where Baraka asks you. And I was like, yeah, cool, let's do that. And then it adds a lot of more context and meaning to that conversation. And yeah.
So there's this aspect of the pedagogy of the oppressed that nothing is really neutral.
Mm-hmm.
Everything in the world leans in some direction.
Mm-hmm.
Either it is for the liberation of the people or for the oppression of the people.
Yeah.
And you chose moments in that film very deliberately.
Mm-hmm.
You chose to be present and to stay present when police were invading events where Stella was there. um, you also chose to enter the bedroom and get shots of menopausal hot flashes. You
Mm-hmm.
chose and then you even filmed certain things that you then chose to exclude from the
Mm-hmm.
film. Um but if you had stuck with that conventional verite understanding,
Yeah.
would you have ended up with the same film?
It would have been a different film, of course, but I think in the end there was a reason why I told that film, and that reason would still be actualized, I think.
Mm.
The style was informed in the end by my participant, and I'm someone who allows myself also to be influenced and not to be rigid, because even though I went there thinking, okay, I want to make a cinema verite film, I realized Taylor wants to talk to me. She would turn to me all the time. There's a lot of excluded scenes where she'd just be like talking to me and mentioning my name. Somebody was telling me like, why is your name mentioned so many times? I'm like, I wish she knew how many times my name is mentioned, but we just had to cut a lot of those scenes out. But it became a dialogue by
Mm.
like in a natural way. And so
So much so that it would almost be like erasure to kind of like erase all of the dialogue that happens between
yeah,
the people
yeah.
that you were filming and then like the crew rather.
Yeah, so, and I'm sure we could have still made a different, verite film. We still have enough footage to have made that. But I think sometimes you can't just stick to the style. The substance also matters. And for me, the process, also matters. And the process was that we were constantly in conversation. There's a lot of scenes where I just had to hold myself back so much, because,
Mm.
yeah, that's how I was being invited into this process. Yeah.
And this also shows up in your fiction work because I feel like when you have an actor that you have really chosen, and you kind of like trust their talent and they put a little spin on something that's like different maybe from what you wrote in the script.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're very listening to that.
I think that's what I love about film is that every new person you collaborate with, they bring their energy, they bring their ideas, and I always want to have room for that. So I want to I've allowed like, improv in some scenes where, the person is not comfortable with this one line. Of course there's usually like the goal of the scene and we can't lose that, especially in fiction. But if there's like more creativity that's coming from other people, yes, this is a creative, collaborative endeavor. Um, and then one of the things, and actually what I wanted to say to the last question you mentioned, is about this thing that really, really impressed me from when I was reading Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And one of them was this idea was the idea that the oppressed, there's always a risk of the oppressed wanting to be the
Uh,
oppressor
uh,
because all they've ever seen is that oppressor. And when I think about directing, I think about it like that. Like, you don't want to be the oppressor. You want to create an alternative system.
uh,
So as oppressed people, I think for a long time, our world and views are informed by what we see from our oppressors. And it's easy to just like try to be like them because we've been under the thumb so long. So
mm,
you get out and you're like, yes, I'm in power now. And I think I've been in conversation with myself about that as well, with my directing, to always
mm,
be like, you cannot do it that way. You have to be able to create an alternative process, an alternative result, an alternative way of doing things, system. We can't replace our oppressors with ourselves. And that's what I also like about Stella and filming her, because I think she's always constantly also like questioning even the movement that she's part of. Like, we cannot be the same as the oppressor. We have to do
mm.
better. We have to create alternative ways of leadership, of living together, of everything. Yeah.
So I kind of I interrupted you when you were about to mention something about heaven sounds boring. So as we go out from this first part of our conversation, is there anything else you would like to say before
Wait,
before
what
we
was I
call it
going
a
to
day
say
for now?
about heaven sounds boring. No, I was going to talk about conscientization of the father in that film. Because I think in Heaven Sounds Boring, we have this dad who believes, I'm your father, I know it's good for you. And this kid was like, but do you know that I talk to my dead grandma? And do you know the wisdom that I carry from, the dead? And so I think it's a hard time because when you're like saying goodbye to somebody that you're not ready to say goodbye to, it's hard to listen to anything. But because he's in that vulnerable position, this is their child, I think they're forced to be in that process of being like, so you're saying that, there's more to afterlife than what my Christianity tells me. So I like that idea of like being in conversation with sometimes the smaller person that's challenging you and telling you this is not the only way to do things. There's better ways, there's other ways, and that's the only way we make the world better. So I think it's like one of those things that that I sneaked in like Heaven Sounds Boring with the daughter challenging the father. Yeah.
So we'll make sure that Nitumwesiga, we have some of your short films and links to other projects and things that you're involved with in the show notes so that listeners can check them out more. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Hi! We hope you enjoyed the conversation on this episode of Troublemakers and feel inspired to stir up some good trouble in your own community. Do feel free to check out our other episodes and subscribe to Troublemakers Podcast in your preferred podcast app. You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook as troublemakers.podcast for all the latest updates, behind-the-scenes content, and sneak peeks of what's coming next. We also love to hear from our listeners. You can email us via troublemakersthepodcast@gmail.com or simply drop a DM through our social media. And hey, if you enjoyed this episode, take a moment and share it with a friend or leave us a review. It really helps us grow our community of troublemakers. Keep shaking things up.